Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of the Raw Men podcast. And tonight I'm having a special guest, Professor Sean Carroll, with a PhD from Harvard. He's a theoretical physicist and author of The Particle at the End of the Universe. And I happened to catch Mr. Carroll at the American Humanist Association back in a couple of years ago in San Diego, and he was giving a speech about how there is no afterlife, among other things. In the interest of epistemology, I just wanted to call him into the show to talk about that and some of the other things he's doing. Professor Carroll, Dr. Carroll, Mr. Carroll, how are you doing, sir?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
And Mark, did you have any announcements for the beginning of our show?
I don't. I'm excited to listen to the good doctor talk. I like this subject, and I just want to roll right into it.
Okay. Well, it often comes up in questions of epistemology where people get upset that they don't want me to know anything. They want to be able to say that they know things that, as Peter Boghossian says, that they want to be able to say that they know things they don't know. And so when they argue about how they believe things, they say, well, I don't just believe it, I know it. And they're very assertive about that. And, of course, I have to argue that if you can't show it, then you don't know it. And just because, it's not like Gnosticism, just because you believe it doesn't mean that you know it. It doesn't matter how convinced you are. You have to be able to show that you're right, especially when you have a half a dozen different people that are all convinced that they have the absolute truth and everybody else is absolutely wrong. Obviously, logically, only one of them can be correct. We have to have some way of knowing what we know. So, referring back to the presentation that you gave some reasons why it's possible to know things like that there's no afterlife. And I also like the reference that you made in that speech about the misattribution of causation. Like you mentioned a nurse in a children's hospital, a whole bunch of children had died in that hospital, and so everybody blamed her. And it reminded me an awful lot of a very similar story I heard about a witch trial where there was a number of people that had cattle that went out, and they all decided it was because this new person had moved into town before all this cattle died, so it must have been her fault.
Yep.
So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah.
So, what can you tell me about that, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of very important issues here that you're raising. One is that when you're talking about knowing almost anything outside a very restricted realm of mathematics and logic, you shouldn't use words like prove things. When you talk to a scientist and talk about how do we prove that this is true, they always seem to hem and haw because they've been trained as scientists to think that a mathematical proof starts with some axiom and then rigorously derives an answer. And nothing in science or empirical world epistemology is ever like that. We never prove things. So in some sense, if you want to define knowing as knowing with 100% certitude, we never know anything either. So I don't even like to use those words. I mean, my spiel about life after death was not, I wouldn't even say how we know it's not true. It's why we have very, very good reasons for believing it's not true. There's degrees of belief, and you might say, well, I think that this is true with a 50% chance, 90% chance. Once you get to 99.999%, you might as well just say that's true and move on with your life. And I think that's the position we're in when it comes to life after death. It's not going to be true. It's not there. And as a secularist, atheist, humanist, naturalist, I think that that's one of the things we should admit. I think that that's sort of one of the few things about this view of the world that makes me sad. I wish there was life after death. I wish I could at least live a lot longer than circa 100 years. But that's what the world says. That's how things are. So admitting that and figuring out how to deal with it and shaping your life around that, I think, is very important.
Once upon a time, I actually heralded Jedi as my sincere religious belief when I was a young man, and it was greatly disappointing to me not only to find out that there really was no such thing as psionic powers as I once believed that there was. I used to think that telepathy was possible, and maybe there was some. I believed some of the stuff some of the hype and the nonsense stories in the media about how people were doing remote seeing or reading people's minds or doing telekinesis like you see on those Russian experiments where it turns out to be just a simple magic trick, and very disappointing to know that when you're midway through life that this is all you got, and that that realistically anything else you want to pretend to have is something you're just going to pretend that that's there, because it can't really be.
It's an important lesson in terms of epistemology, because there's a recent incident that I shouted at people on the internet about, because there was a report out of Texas, out of NASA, that they built a space drive that uses no propulsion. That they've tested a machine. It's like you're sitting in your car and you get it moving by pushing on the steering wheel. Now, this violates all sorts of laws of physics. It's not actually true. It's just bullshit. But people really, really want it to be true. So despite the fact that the evidence for it is extremely flimsy, they make all sorts of excuses for why it might be on the right track. And I think that what they're doing is exactly the opposite of what we should do. If we want something to be true, that's when we should be maximally skeptical about it. That's when, because we have this built-in cognitive bias, we make excuses for things that we want to be true. So whether it's life after death, faster than light travel, telekinesis, when I was young, I wanted to believe in all of these things, and I tried to be very careful, and I don't think that any of them stand up to scrutiny.
Are you talking about the thing that was originally supposedly or reportedly done in China, where they created something that could be a Starship propulsion engine, and then this was reportedly duplicated, I think, in California, but to a fraction of the power that was reported in China, but they still said that this means of propulsion actually did work, just a tiny degree? Are we talking about the same thing?
I think that's part of the story. I think it goes back even further than that, and there's one version called the M drive, EM. There's another version called the Cannae drive. A guy named Sawyer was one of the people who proposed the idea. Sonny White is a NASA technician who's actually been doing the experiments. And if people say, well, how could it be possible they would get these results without it being true? The answer is easy. Probable experimental error. It's very, very easy to make mistakes. In fact, the people at NASA originally, they did two versions of the experiment, one where the effect was supposed to happen and one where it wasn't, and it happened in both of them. So, at that point, you say, well, they're clearly capable of making mistakes. I think that I'm going to continue to believe in the law of conservation of momentum rather than their unrefereed reports that appear on basically random websites on the internet. I don't think that's a very strong evidence we have right there.
So not only have you taken away my psionic Jedi powers, but you've also taken away my Starship and hyperdrive. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's a long series of disillusionments, but then again, I've given you relativity and quantum mechanics and the Big Bang and evolution. So I think that what we get for it is better than what we've given up.
Well, and I would agree with you. In the arguments of evolution versus creationism that I'm usually involved in, we have this thing about where everybody wants to believe things, where people want to believe things in terms of dichotomies, where you have good and bad, and you have right and wrong, and very, very black and white judgments. And it's hard for me to get people to understand that, like, nobody is good or evil, that everybody's in this, this U-graph.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true, and it's also very relevant to this kind of discussion we're having, because, one of the sad things about the secularist movement these days is that it's very us versus them, right? People try to figure out which side you're on many, many different issues, and if you're on the side they want you to be on, you're their friend, and if you're on the side that they don't want you to be on, you're their enemy. And I'm all in favor of at least trying to talk to other people as if they're rational human beings. Sometimes it fails, and eventually, people do get put on the enemies list. But there's a large number of people with whom I disagree, but I'm not going to count them as my enemy. I'm still going to try to talk to them. I really hate it when people say, you will never change minds, rational discussion is not the way to do this, we just have to fight and have battles. I'm still a believer in the power of reason.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because this has also been my biggest complaint with the atheist and skeptic in the secular community. Is it's an irony to me that people tell me that because I blog where I do, that this means that I must be in lockstep unison with everybody else who blogs there, and that I have to hold, or I'm oppressed to hold this unified position and believe exactly as I'm told to, when this is not even remotely true. And in fact, the accusations that are being made against me are more of the type that they're actually projecting onto me. You know, this whole us versus them mentality. I try to argue, and many times I've been on stage, I will argue that I don't agree with anybody about everything, you know. And there are people with whom I disagree about some significant things, but we still have these other things in common, and we also still have a common enemy and a common goal, and we need to be aware of that, and I would think put away the lesser differences that are actually impeding our progress to the primary goal.
Yeah, and you study a little bit of neuroscience, you realize you don't even agree with yourself. Your different parts of your brain are going to believe different things. This is a part of what consciousness is all about. So I think you have to, you know, there's sort of ways to be a good person irrespective of your substantive epistemological beliefs that I value more highly than coming down on the right side of this or that argument. So, and you know what? It actually does work. You know, people who say, well, you'll never change people's minds and so forth are just empirically wrong. People's minds do change. People's minds are made up in the first place when they're young, right? You know, there's a time before anyone was either atheist or religious because they were too young to have an opinion about it. And approaching those people with an attitude of respect and friendliness changes a lot more minds than trying to show how dumb they are.
Yeah, and on both of those points, I mean, well, no, I you know what? I just lost it. It just went in my head and went away.
Mark, you start. I still want to talk about why I think that we have good reason.
Well, what I was going to say is,
I think, Mark, you've got a delay going on. I don't think Mark had intended to talk over you just there, and now he's trying to measure how far the delay is.
Yeah, I didn't know what was going on there, but what I was going to say was, within the secular community, we have our inner community differences that will completely shut other groups out. But even working with interfaith, like we had mentioned, and Aaron knows, Sean, I've just met you, but Aaron knows that my biggest goal and my biggest pursuit in the community is working with the most progressive of faith leaders and Christians and even Muslims to a certain extent that are fighting a lot of battles that we're fighting, separation of church and state, anti-LGBT, things like that. And to do that, you have to put aside your differences that don't matter about what you're fighting against, like the life after death. Clearly, I don't believe there's life after death, but religious people do in a way, but I don't really care about that if they're trying to get rights for gays. And that's my biggest complaint, just like you guys were saying about the community, is how we can't compartmentalize our differences if we're fighting a common enemy.
Yeah, and then I remembered what it was that I was going to say before that reflected on both of the points you made previously. I got into a discussion with, I don't remember if he was Muslim or Hindu, but anyway, he gave me this speech about, you know, look, I'm never going to change your mind, you're never going to change my mind, so there's no reason to talk about this. And I have to point out that, well, the reason that I'm never going to change your mind is that you've decided that you're already going to reject any evidence that I ever present to you, but you actually could change my mind because I'm open to that. And even when someone has closed their mind to any kind of any new evidence that they're going to hold to an a priori belief, there's sometimes possible to get a chink in that armor, and that's why it is that many of the best advocates that we have of reason and rationality were once former believers and sincere believers, and even seminary students and so forth, before they eventually come out of that. So it is possible to awaken even the most immersed mind in that kind of dogma.
Absolutely, and I think that part of the reason why people are overly skeptical about that is because they imagine that if you did change someone's mind, they would come up to you, you would give them a brilliant argument, and they would go, oh, you're right, I never thought about it that way, my mind has changed. That is the way it works. You know, changing someone's mind, especially if it's something that is a deeply held belief, something that is central to their view of the world. This is not going to be any one event, because it's going to be an accumulation of little things that they're going to be thinking of, that they're going to, be wondering about in their own time, long after you talk to them. And sometimes it won't work, sometimes it will, but it's the under-the-surface internal thinking that you're setting in motion that's going to matter, not the aha moment that they get at the very end of it.
Yeah, I would like to think that, you can just come up and tell somebody, there's no God, right? And then they just say, oh, there is not? Oh, my bad.
Right. That doesn't happen. Yes.
Well, no, there actually is one case where somebody said that actually did happen, and it was somebody that I met in Europe recently. I think he was in Iceland. He said he was a minister. He was some sort of evangelical minister, and he was talking to somebody trying to convert people, and somebody just mentioned him after he gives this whole long spiel talking about his beliefs. Somebody says, that's all just bullshit, right? and this minister is telling me, like a week ago in Iceland, he said that was actually the thing that did it. It just that was the catalyst that got. I couldn't believe that anybody had ever reported that was it.
I suspect that he might not even know himself what the actual reason was. There might be something that went on in his prior conversations with other people or reading or whatever that set him on that trajectory. But it's a common phenomenon in physics. It's a phase transition. Things work underneath that you don't know about, but then suddenly the water boils or something like that. That's how it's going to go.
No, that's a good segue to get back into the topic. I mean, when these people want to tell me, they just make an assertion about how they can explain everything by explaining nothing, by taking advantage of whatever science can't explain, by pretending that they can explain it, by, if science doesn't know the answer, then it was supernatural, and they don't understand that what they're actually asking, what they're advocating or what they're pleading for is magic by definition. And they think that they don't even need a mechanism, right? Well, God can do whatever he wants. Why? How? I asked, when I was 8 years old, I asked my babysitter how it was that Jesus turned water into wine, because I was looking at a diagram of different types of molecules in a science book, and I said, well, we have water that's, it's oxygen and these two hydrogens, and then you have alcohol. Look at what a complicated molecule this is, and so you're going to have the fruit juice, and how complicated is that going to be? So how did Jesus change oxygen and hydrogen into all of this with carbon in it? And of course, she just blew up at me and said, how dare you question the ways of God?
See, if she had known about protons and neutrons, she would have been able to give you an explanation for how you could rearrange the fundamental particles. But yeah, I think it's an important thing, and it goes back to this idea that we don't ever know empirical things about the world with either 0% or 100% confidence, and that's okay. And people sort of really have a built-in desire to either put something at 0 or 1. They don't like being in between. They want things to be either true or false. And the whole ethos of science is that we don't know yet. Like, we're trying to get better and better, but we don't have the final theory of everything, and that's okay. But at the same time, there are things we know awfully well. And people want to believe either one of those two things, but not both. Like, either science has the answers and science is the right way to get it, or because science is very tentative and incremental, science knows nothing. Like, anything is up for grabs. And you try to explain to them, even though science does make progress and we improve upon our previous understanding, there are parts of our current understanding that are just right, that are never going to go away. Even if it's with 99.999% confidence, that's good enough. We didn't used to know about atoms. We didn't used to know that water and wine were made of atoms. Now we do, but that fact is not going to change. We're going to learn more about how atoms work, about the quarks and leptons that make them up, the space-time in which they move. But 1,000 years from now, even if we have uninterrupted scientific progress, water will still be H2O. That fact will not go away. And there's a lot of such facts. People underestimate how much we know about the universe, how much we know to such a high degree of confidence that it's not really worth spending our resources questioning them. We know how the particles in these atoms behave. We know what the particles are, we know what the forces are that give rise to them, that push them around, and we know that there aren't any new particles or new forces that are possibly relevant for human beings that we haven't yet discovered. And that's an amazingly important fact about the universe and scientific progress, and people are very, very reluctant to accept it. So they want to say, well, science doesn't know everything. And I'm like, yes, it doesn't know everything, but it knows this. This is a thing that science knows more than well enough to get on with our lives.
Another one of the quotes most often attributed to me is that religion or that science doesn't know everything, but religion doesn't know anything, because everything that we've ever shown that we do know has been by the scientific method, whereas all religious claims are either not evidently true or they're evidently not true. And what I mean by that is, of course, that there's nothing that any religion can actually show that is really right. They don't have any facts that are exclusively concordant with or indicative of their religious belief. It's all based on faith. And then we're talking about evolution. I can present facts which are universally, or exclusively supportive of evolution, like transitional species and the observation of macroevolution in controlled conditions, ERVs and various other things. I can show these facts which are exclusively supportive of evolution and which are not concordant with creationism, like dysfunctional primate genes in the human genome, things of that sort. And then I can say, okay, now this is what's true about evolution. This is what we can show about evolution that is really true. What can you show me is really true about your belief? And of course, there's nothing there. The best that they can do is go back to science doesn't prove everything, or science doesn't know everything, and you can't prove you're not a brain in a vat. Because
and they're right. You can't prove that, but it's no way to go through life. I do think that epistemology is hard, and it's easy to sort of make the difficulties in understanding how science works perfectly blow up into saying, well, therefore I don't need to accept any of its conclusions. I think it's a mistake. I think that science is by far, like you say, the best way that we have of actually gaining information about the world. But again, there's this gray area thing that we have to learn to live with, that science is always going to be subject to revision when better data comes along. And that's the strength of the scientific method. One of the ways that I like to put it is, there's a fundamental principle of knowledge, which is you should always be asking yourself, how do I know this isn't just bullshit? And that's a different question than, is this just bullshit, right? I mean, the is this just bullshit question is, is it true or false? But how do I know it's not just bullshit is an important question. Like, okay, someone tells me how many circles there are of hell. How would I know that they didn't just make them up? I mean, maybe it's true. Maybe it's true that when I meditate, my mind leaves the body or something like that. All right, how would I know? How would I test my belief if I wanted to be skeptical? How would I assuage that skepticism? And that's what science lets you do, and that's what science is especially good at compared to other approaches to trying to learn things about the world.
So when these people want to bring up that we can't prove either side, as if that means that they can still go ahead and assert as fact that what they believe they know to be true, when they tell me that I can't prove something, they want to use a different context of proof. I mean, they're using a mathematical context of proof, which of course doesn't apply in science, not at least not in the positive sense. So I have to explain that what they're talking about uses a legal definition of proof, wherein proof is an overwhelming preponderance of evidence.
Right.
And by that definition, we actually can prove this case. Again, we can't ever prove anything by 100%, but it comes down to what have we got right? Here's the things that we got right, and here's the things about your perspective that I can show to be wrong. Now show something that's wrong with mine, and also, more importantly, show something that's right with yours. And again, the best that they can do is criticize me on things that they can't really understand and still can't support anything that they have that actually works. How does God speak words and make things happen, for example? How does the soul exist? How does the soul leave the body when you're dead? How does this supernatural existence exist? Once upon a time, when I believed in this kind of a Jedi thing that I honestly did once upon a time believe in, again, it was because I had seen Kirlian photography. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but back in the 70s, are you?
Yes, I am.
Okay. For those who aren't, back in the 70s, there was this experiment that they showed on Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and I, being a 12-year-old boy at that time, I thought I was watching real science. So they take a leaf, and they take a photograph of this leaf on this special plate, and you only see the leaf show up as phosphorescent blue sparks. So there's some kind of... This is similar to the midichlorians in Star Wars, by the way. So they cut the leaf in half, and they photograph it again. And at first, you only see the half of the leaf that you would expect to see. But on an overexposure, it would show the whole leaf, even though only half of the leaf is there. And this, to a 12-year-old boy who doesn't realize that he's watching bullshit, it very much looked like this was proof of living energy, like some sort of a life force. So the idea that I had about how life works with this spiritual world that I've been convinced by the media actually exists was something akin to like making a clay sculpture. You mix the water in with the clay becomes malleable, just like life is malleable and functions and moves and flows. But when it dies, and it's ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the spirit goes back to the oneness, just like the water evaporating out of the clay to go back into the universal oneness of the clouds and the biosphere and so forth. This was the image that I had. And now I find out that none of that actually has any reason to believe that it exists. We can't prove that it doesn't exist,
right.
But neither do we have any reason to believe that it does, other than a sheer desire to believe that.
Yeah, and this, I call part of this the Princess Elizabeth problem. I don't know if you know Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. You know her story?
No, I don't.
Everyone should know her story. I want to campaign to get her much more famous than she currently is. So she lived in the early 1600s, the beginning of the 30 Years' War. Her father was the king of Bohemia for 9 months before he made some disastrous military decisions and was deposed. So she grew up in exile, but she got this amazingly good education. She was renowned at, she spoke many different languages, she knew astronomy and geometry and so forth, and she struck up a friendship with René Descartes, who was also in exile for slightly different reasons. All the reasons came down to religion, ultimately, in fact, but they were in exile in The Hague for different reasons. And she had read Descartes' books, and Descartes, of course, really gave the most philosophically sophisticated version of dualism, where there was a mind and there was an immaterial soul separate from the body. And she said, well, okay, how does the mind affect the body? How does the mind tell the body what to do? How do they talk to each other? Do they talk back and forth? Is it some push and pull? Is there action and reaction and so forth? And essentially, he could never give a good answer. He tried. At one point, Descartes believed that the pineal gland was where the soul talked to the body, because they had sort of started dissecting cadavers, and they found all these glands. They didn't know what they did, so Descartes was like, here it is. Here's the radio receiver for the soul. Turns out not to actually be true. But there's a modern version of Princess Elizabeth's question, which is, how does any supernatural or non-physical force interact with the atoms and the photons and the quarks and the gluons that we know are in your body? There's certain particles we know are in your body. We know their physical description. We have equations that govern their behavior. And in every experiment ever done in the history of science, these equations work. So you want to believe that there is some metaphysical stuff, some essence of ephemeral nonsense that somehow is your soul, that communicates to your brain and then makes you talk and things like that. Show me where the equations are wrong. Show me how I would change these equations to allow for this stuff to interact with the stuff of which we're made. And that's why we think that there's no good reason to believe in life after death, because there's no way, given every experiment we've ever done in science, to allow this immaterial soul to interact with the material stuff of our brains and our body.
Now, this question relates strongly to a lot of alternative medicine stuff and things like homeopathy. It alarms me that that they have like a homeopathic hospital in England, for example. When you got something that they don't have a mechanism for how this works, and statistically it doesn't work. So they have to use regular medicine, real medicine, in order to compensate for where you get at best a placebo effect. Right. People want to argue with me that anything is possible, but and this is the core of the argument. It seems that anything is possible, but not everything is possible. There are some things that are impossible, and I often mention that the old adage that monkeys might fly out of my ass, which of course is impossible. That can't happen.
I would say it's just very, very, very unlikely. It's so unlikely that you don't need to worry about it.
Okay, granted. So in science, in order for scientists to say that something is possible, they don't just take the assumption that anything is possible, because there are absurdities like what we just brought up. In order for scientists to say that something is possible, they have to establish a possibility. There has to be a precedent or a parallel or something to indicate that it is possible to do this. If you ask a scientist, is this possible, he's not always going to say yes. like you brought up earlier in the show about, let's say faster than light travel, for example, and this other thing that this type of thrust mechanism that isn't really thrust that violates all these laws of physics. So this is, if it violates the laws of physics, then it is physically impossible by definition.
Well, except that we don't know the final laws of physics. I really think that I would never want to use the word impossible in the context of science, but I would want to say it is so unlikely that I'm not going to waste my time thinking about it.
Okay.
The example that I use is, and no one understands this. Everyone gets this wrong, but I'm going to use it anyway because I like it so much. Is the moon made of green cheese? This is a question you could ask yourself. And the answer is no, it is not made of green cheese. Let's be clear about that. It is not made of green cheese. But okay, how do you know? Well, we've looked at the moon. We've taken spectra of the moon. We think we have a understanding of what it's made of. It's sort of rocks and dust and so forth. We've even visited the moon and brought pieces of it back. And someone says, well, number one, have you personally visited it? Are you sure that that's true? Or number two, how do you know that the outer layer of the moon isn't moon dust, but like 2 meters deep it starts being green cheese? How do we know for sure? Well, you can say, actually, we've sort of looked at the effects of meteorite strikes on the moon and the oscillations, and we've mapped out the density profile, and it seems to fit with sort of nickel and iron and things like that, and rocks, and, well, maybe it's special green cheese with exactly that density profile. And ultimately, you don't have the ability to prove with mathematical certainty that the moon is not made of green cheese. Nevertheless, you don't have to take it seriously. We have a whole understanding of the solar system and what it's made of and the origin of these different pieces. We have a whole understanding of cheese. It involves cows and milk, and they're very, very different things. So it's not that we've proven that the moon is not made of green cheese. It's that there's so much about our picture of the world that would have to be wrong for this to be true that it's not worth taking seriously. And the same thing is true about telekinesis or warp drive or life after death. It's not that we've proven that they're impossible. It's that so much that we think we have about our knowledge of the world would have to be wrong that these possibilities are not worth taking seriously.
Well, remember that when I'm using proof in this context where I know that positive proof logically does not apply in a mathematical sense, that I'm using a legal definition of proof, which is an overwhelming preponderance of evidence and not 100% mathematical certainty.
Sure, and I think that with your definitions, everything you say is completely correct, but I know from experience that people will equivocate on the definitions. So people will use the word proof in one context in one sentence and in another definition in another sentence. So as a personal choice, I'm just not using words like proof and impossible when it comes to science.
Okay, well, you did say in your speech that there's ways that we can know that there is no afterlife, and you went to.
I will use words like no, yes, with with the caveat that I don't mean proof. I mean evidence beyond reasonable doubt. I don't mean mathematical proof. Legal proof is a perfectly fine standard there. Yeah.
Okay, we can both clarify that we're not talking about a mathematical certainty, but to the point that it would be perverse to imagine otherwise.
That's right. It would be crazy.
Yeah. So on the and the description that was given was what is the mechanism by which these things work. Now I mentioned turning water into wine, and you mentioned how you know the particle physics in order to do that, but you still don't know how you can get a first century sheep herder to do that.
No. Yeah. I mean, there's no. I said that your babysitter, if she had known a little bit of particle physics, could have bamboozled your young self.
Okay.
Talk about rearranging the protons and the neutrons. If she'd been honest and known some particle physics, she would know that there's no actual way to make that happen without essentially setting off a thermonuclear bomb. So there's really no way, realistically, to make it happen. It's not worth paying attention to. If someone says they turn water into wine, I presume they mean they use that water to water their vineyard, and then they grew grapes, and then they made wine, because that's the only way that we know how to do it.
One of the things that I'm going to be talking about at the Imagine No Religion conference in a couple of weeks in Canada is the concept of having a mechanism by which these things are to be accomplished, that it can't just be asserted. Like religion stems back to somebody making a clay figurine and then breathing into it the breath of life, and it becomes alive. Well, there's no mechanism behind any of that. There's no functioning organs. It ignores so much. I mean, the idea of all of the religious beliefs that we came that are all they're all geocentric, that have to make apologies later to account for the vastness of the cosmos if they ever make themselves aware of it at all. I want to talk about how there's a mechanism necessary in order to actually understand something, and you can't profess to know something if you don't have any kind of understanding of it that you can show or demonstrate.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of the same thing is just to say that things fit together. Claims do not exist independently of each other. If someone says, I saw a woman riding a bicycle today, you would probably say, okay, that's something you could see, I believe you. And if they said, I saw an octopus riding a bicycle today, you would be more skeptical of that. Now, the evidence that you've just been given is exactly equivalent in both cases, but one is a much harder to accept claim because your belief that that's the kind of thing you're likely to see is much lower because it fits into something you know about the world. That's why the U.S. Patent Office will no longer even consider patent applications for perpetual motion machines. Maybe someday one will work. You can't prove it in the sense of the metaphysical sense, but it's not worth paying attention to because it's not just the law of conservation of energy. It's the laws of electromagnetism and materials and atoms, and all of these tell us that you're not going to make a perpetual motion machine. So it's really not worth paying attention to a claim to the contrary. It's not something that can exist in isolation, just like bringing a little figurine into existence. Well, what memories does the figurine have? How does its circulatory system work? What does its DNA look like? What does its junk DNA look like? It's just not, in ancient times when we knew very little, that was not a lot to ask that that's plausible, but today we know so much that it's not worth taking those things seriously.
I apologize. Obviously, I have a dog going berserk at something.
That's your dog. Yeah.
So let me. I don't know if I can go into this realm of thought or not, and be very comfortable with it. But I wasn't satisfied with simply believing things. I mean, I wanted to understand what I believed. If it was true at all, then there had to be a way to understand it. So in the belief that I had, where I didn't have this, this universal God that was like some sort of a cosmic Rod Serling that wrote, good things happening to good people and so forth. I wish somebody would do something with that dog. Hold on a moment.
Well, good. While he's gone, let me just follow up on what Aaron just said. A lot of people in the sort of skeptical atheist community don't like the word belief. They take the word belief to be a synonym for unjustified belief. And in my view, hanging out with professional philosophers, belief has a very technical meaning. You can have justified belief or unjustified belief. You can have degrees of belief. So I don't mind using the word belief to characterize an opinion or even a piece of knowledge that I have. I believe that 2 + 2 = 4. I have very good reasons for believing that. But there are good beliefs and bad beliefs, justified beliefs and unjustified beliefs. So it's not a matter of what beliefs you have, but what the justification is for having them.
Yeah, and I won't add to that at all. I'll just say that I obviously have the exact same position, and have made similar arguments in the past. But what I was talking about with regard to wanting to understand what it was that I believed, when I thought that life was animated by this this influence of this spiritual aspect of reality, I wanted to know how far does that extend. It was like Obi-Wan Kenobi said that the Force is an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, and binds the galaxy together. And so I imagined, as I said, the clay figure. When the water evaporates out of that, it goes back into the oneness, which is the hydrosphere. Or when you do a reincarnation, I imagine that this glass of water is you, your current you, and when you die, you pour the glass of water back into the ocean. Well, now, or into a lake, say, to take out the salt effect. But immediately, let's say you're going to be reborn, so you scoop that water back up again. Even if you scoop it right from where you just poured it, what you're going to get isn't going to be 100% you. So I'm trying to understand how reincarnation works. I'm trying to understand where is the extent of this supernatural sphere. And of course, when you try to analyze supernatural beliefs in a scientific perspective, everything just goes tits up, pretty much. I mean, it all falls apart. And eventually I had to discard everything that I really liked believing because there wasn't any substance to support it, and there wasn't any way that made sense in trying to understand it. There was no mechanism or rationality or logic by which any of this could work. And so that's why I had to reject it all eventually.
Yeah, and I think that, there's a certain buy-in that people make at some point in their lives to the naturalistic worldview that says, I can actually make sense of this stuff in terms of everything I see, in terms of the physical stuff of the world obeying the laws of nature. And there's various stumbling blocks that people have at different levels of seriousness. Like some people want to say, well, but you'll never explain where the universe came from, why there is a universe at all. Other people will say, well, but you can't explain why there is consciousness or life or something organized like that. Others will say, well, you can't explain why there's right and wrong, why you should act in a good way rather than a bad way. And, there's a lot of work. I think that naturalists and atheists need to sort of respect the amount of effort and the amount of intellectual project we still have in front of us to put together the entire worldview. It's a tricky thing because we're not saying we have all the answers. We're saying that once we do have all the answers, they will fit into this view of the world that makes a lot of sense. The alternative, the theistic or supernatural world view of the world, has been losing for 500 years now, and it's just nowhere near as plausible as this nice, clean, unified, naturalistic view.
So one of the arguments that I got recently from a family member was that there were a couple of people who had died and then had been revived and had reported seeing Jesus, and both of these people corroborated each other's story that Jesus has, in fact, blue eyes. So how can you argue with that?
I know, yes. I actually participated in a debate last year, I think it was, on the question of is there life after death, and Stephen Novella and I were on the no side, and on the yes side was Ray Moody and Eben Alexander. You probably know Eben Alexander. Do you know of him?
No.
Well, count your blessings. He is, he's become a very wealthy man. He's been on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time now with his book called Proof of Heaven. He's the neurosurgeon who died and was in a coma and then was revived and came back telling stories of he had visited heaven and what it was like and so forth. And actually, when you hear these stories about people corroborating each other's versions of what they saw and so forth, Alexander's story is like weak compared to most other people's stories. Basically, he was in a coma. He went and he visited his sister, and then he came back. And, he had a good time when he was in heaven, and that's the whole story. That's all of his evidence. So, he's asking you to believe that heaven exists because the alternative would be that people in comas would actually hallucinate sometimes. And if you want to believe it, if you want to think it's true, that story has a lot of power, a lot of resonance. But if you want to believe it's true, that's when you should be the most skeptical.
There was a time in my life when I was a neo-pagan spiritualist. And this was at the same time that I was also kind of recognizing Jedi as being the closest simile to whatever it was that I actually believed. Because I knew I wasn't the typical type pagan. I didn't believe in polytheism. I didn't believe in any kind of gods. I was looking at something other than a god. I mean, something maybe like a spiritual form of pantheism with supernatural aspects to it. But at some point in this, like these little bits of occult practices and so forth, I remember having these very profound experiences with otherworldly beings. And some of these were shared experiences, which of course only lent credibility to that. So if you get the impression that when you have a memory, like when you and your friend are encounter all these spiritual entities filling the room, and you can see them very clearly, and they're having physical effects on the objects around you, and it's a terrifying experience that you both shared in this, and you expect that if you don't have any evidence else to go on, that when you happen across that friend again 20 years later, they're going to be able to say, well, they don't know how to explain that any better than you could explain that. What happened with me was that I came to a point where I had to look at that event and remember that this was now the last strand of any religious belief that I had was this memory of these events that, by all of my reckoning, could not actually have happened. But I remember it. I remember it vividly, and I know there was another witness there, so it had to be real. And the sad thing was that before I encountered this person again, I had come to the conclusion that despite my clear memory of this event, that it didn't happen because it couldn't happen. And I'm proud that I came to that conclusion before I met my friend again. But when I did, when I met that person who shared that experience and I talked to him about it, he didn't remember anything like what I did.
Right.
And that didn't only happen once. There was another occasion where, you know, a similar sort of thing where you have another person participating in it. You know, the transcendental meditation thing. We both experience the same thing. We both talk about it later, and then when I talk to her later on, she says, "No, that didn't happen the way you remember either." And both of these people, where they both used to be into all kinds of spiritual woo themselves, as I was then, they are both where I am now. They're both complete rationalists and don't believe anything on faith.
Yeah, you know, it's the reason why science and the scientific method are important is because human beings are terrible at both observation and memory. We're just empirically really bad at this. I have a friend, Carol Tavris, who is a speaker at TAM and other places. I think it's partly my fault that she's been a speaker at TAM because I recommended her, but she's a social psychologist and she studies cognitive biases and why people get wrong. And just like physicists like me complain about science fiction movies with faster-than-light travel or gravity doing crazy things, she couldn't stand the movie Inception because she was like, what do you mean? We're going through all this effort to put a false memory in somebody. Putting a false memory in somebody is the easiest thing in the world. We know how to do that. It's no problem at all. People's memories bear very little relationship to many of the things that actually happened in their lives. So eyewitness testimony, your personal reflections, or your introspection, to take that as evidence of something so dramatic and profound that you'd be willing to give up on the laws of physics or the way the world works because of that memory, that is not something you should do. You should put very low weight on the evidence of your personal memory of things. That's why science doesn't allow that into its database.
One more anecdotal addition to that was, I mean, I realized that it was possible through ambiance, through psyching somebody up, and sometimes just candlelight or music or whatever. It was so easy to encourage someone to hear and see and experience or feel whatever it was that they already believed in and really wanted to experience. It wasn't hard to do, to convince people that they would actually perceive things with a bit of encouragement. And then when I realized they're not actually experiencing this. They're following cues from me, and I'm generating an illusion in their minds. It wasn't a moment later before I realized that I wasn't just doing that to them. I was doing that to me. Right. And that was the end of my faith.
And people have an idea, sort of informal idea, that memory is kind of like videotape, right? Like we have some recording of what we see and what is happening, and it's stored somewhere in our brain. But again, neuroscience is hard. We don't know everything. We know a lot less in neuroscience than we do in particle physics, for example. But the best evidence we have right now says that memory is a lot more like a stage play than a movie. We don't store the videotape in our brain. We store something a lot more like the script. And whenever we remember something from long ago, we sort of bring together the props from different parts of our memory and we put on the play of that thing going on. So you have parts of your memory that store smells and parts of memory that store the faces of your friends and the shape of the room that you grew up in, and another part that stores sort of this script that says who spoke what at what time. So changing that memory isn't a matter of like going in post-production and changing the whole videotape and redoing the whole thing. It's really like changing a few lines of dialogue. But when you remember that, it's just as vivid. That false memory, because you've misplaced a couple lines of dialogue, is just as believable and firm in your mind as any true memory ever is. So it's just enormously easy, like you said, to sort of nudge people into certain ways of thinking, that they're perceiving something, that they remember something, and that's why that shouldn't count very much. That's why we want repeatability, objectivity, double-blind experiments. the more grand the kind of thing you're trying to find evidence for, the more careful you have to be that you're not fooling yourself.
And I need to also throw in that in these occasions where I would experience these things, there was no drugs, there was no alcohol, there was no mind-altering stimulants, there was no sleep deprivation, there was none of that. It was simply the power of your own imagination psyching yourself to believe something, whereas when we compare that to somebody with the near-death experience, they have all kinds of trauma going on to their brain.
Oh, yeah, no, exactly. It's like the least plausible, reliable witness would be a person having a near-death experience. You shouldn't believe anything that they say, you know?
And how often do we have cases like the child that was famous last year? There was a little boy that that supposedly had a near-death experience and saw Jesus and comes back to talk about it for like a year. That the religious media is really priming up on this kid until finally he says, that never really happened. I just made it up.
And it's the least surprising thing in the world. But again, there's a whole. These beliefs don't exist in isolation. When I gave this debate with Aben Alexander and Steve Novella and Ray Moody, the question that the audience, the people in the audience who were pro-life after death, their biggest logical argument was, well, when you die, where does the energy go? You have some sort of energy in you. It needs to go somewhere. That's just science, after all. And you say, well, where does the energy go when you shut your laptop? The laptop energy doesn't float around in the universe. It's the same amount of energy in the laptop, it's just not doing anything. Where does the energy go when you snuff out the flame of a candle? The candle flame, or the laptop doing something, or a living person, these are processes. These are not substances. It's not like some stuff that is moving from place to place. It's an activity that is going on amongst the particles of which you are made. It's a sort of conceptual shift. But they really don't get that. Like they could not quite conceptualize that being alive was like being a burning candle. Once you sort of get that, it becomes much easier to believe the rest of the naturalistic story.
There's some analogies with computers that actually work with brains, like when you bring in new software, for example, that can actually change your existing software and cause a different kind of behavior. But the computers are more efficient than the brain in one sense, in that it is possible to store something in a memory that that can remain uncorrupted for a very long period of time, even when the computer is completely off. So you can shut your computer off, you can even damage your computer and just retrieve the hard drive and keep it intact. But people ask me what happens to where do you go when you die? I say, well, what happens to the data on your computer when it suddenly says hard disk not found, or operating system not found, or fatal crash and so forth? It doesn't go anywhere. I mean, if the situation is that a profound injury or a simple chemical injection can change your personality if it goes into the right part of the brain, if changes or adjustments, physical adjustments in the brain can change your personality or change your perceptions about things, then this is where your mind is coming from, and it can't exist independent of the brain that created it.
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson we've been learning over the past 500 years since we started doing science seriously. This kind of game where something that we thought was a substance, was an essence, was a thing, turns out to be a property of other things that we already know about. And, a great example is fire. The burning candle. We used to think that there was a substance called phlogiston. We even had a name for it, that lived inside the candle. And when you light the candle, the phlogiston came out, and that was what the flame was. And now we've explained what fire is, what combustion is. It's just a rearrangement of the atoms, right? We take the atoms from a state where there's some energy locked in them. We release that energy in the form of light and heat, and the atoms get rearranged. So it's important that we understand sort of what went away and what is kept. The idea of phlogiston went away. That was just wrong. That's an example of something that we thought might be there. We didn't have strong evidence for it. It turns out to be wrong. Science gave up on it, and has moved on. We didn't get rid of the idea of fire. Fire is not an illusion. Fire is real, but we've explained what it is. It's a certain kind of process that goes on amongst the particles that make up that candle and the oxygen in the room and so forth. And I would say the same thing is true for many aspects of life, whether it's consciousness or free will for that matter. it's not that we explain it away. Not that it is an illusion and we get rid of it. It's a way of talking about the fundamental processes, which at the end of the day are particles bumping into each other, obeying the laws.
My wife and I do a series of classroom supplement educational videos for middle school and high school kids, and one of my favorite discussions in science is science history, and of course the story of phlogiston and how people would doggedly try to defend or try to find some way to work out the math to still defend how phlogiston could still be real. And and it's like you said before, if it's deeply ingrained, it's hard to get rid of, especially when you're just absolutely convinced that you're right. But that's
right. Back in the day, it was good that they tried to defend that theory because when the evidence was still shaky, you should be very, very careful not to leap to a conclusion. But by now we know better. Like I don't spend time arguing against people who think that the Earth is the center of the solar system. I know they're there. I know they're wrong. But life is too short for me personally to spend too much time on that. There's plenty of interesting questions to which we don't know the answer at the edges of science, at the edges of knowledge that are really worth a debate. Even if I think I know what the answer is, I'm willing to debate because there's other intelligent people who disagree with me. That used to be the case for phlogiston or for the Earth. It is no longer the case for either one.
Yeah, well, I wish that I could say that I don't have the reason to argue with people who believe that the Earth is the center of the universe and that the entire universe orbits around the Earth. But unfortunately, I live in Texas, and the people who believe that have been elected to all the positions of power governing over the state.
I know. I'm very glad that other people are willing to do it. I'm not personally, it was just crazy. But thank goodness there's other people out there with strength to argue against this.
Well, this is and the fact that the people that that are in all the positions of government in this state so often do believe atrocious things like, and I mean literally believing that the entire universe orbits the Earth. Frank Turek gave that an argument in one of his seminars, and I know that there's a lot of people in government here who actually do hold to that kind of position.
No, I know, and I think even though we started out by saying that I want to be in friendly disagreement with people that have different worldviews than I have, there is a line past which friendly disagreement isn't helpful and people are just on the wrong side, and the way to deal with them is combat and embarrassment, not force reason. And I really think that when people are in positions of political power and they're choosing to deny the blatant truths of science and how we know how the world works, then we should be embarrassing them. That should not be a position that a grown-up person in a position of power to be able to get away with holding in our modern society. We should be making fun of them.
Thank you very much, Professor Sean Carroll. It's been great fun to have you on, and I know that a lot of people responded very positively when I said that I was going to be interviewing you. I met you once at a conference a few years ago. I don't think that you remember, but there was a lot of people that really excited to hear from you, and I'm happy to satisfy those people to have you on. Mark, did you have anything that you wanted to add here at the end of our show?
No. Thanks for coming on. This was probably one of our better shows, I think. We'll be sharing it on the podcast link on Spreaker soon. If you would, whenever you see it, if you would go ahead and reshare it, that'd be great. Thanks for everybody for listening. We had between 220 and 300 people watching live during the show today, so that's good.
And of course, most of the views, as we said, come on after the fact. I wish that we could do something about the time zone thing so that we could have people watching in Europe and Australia as well. But it's not that important since we're not taking live calls. So,
Sean, thank you very much for having me on. I always love talking about this stuff in a fun environment.
You've been a great guest. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the show. Good night, everybody.